Is there anywhere like Jerusalem? Loved, threatened, invaded, destroyed and rebuilt time and time again over 30 centuries. It's still the holy city for 3 world religions and holds the faith and dreams of billions of people today. Faith and dreams are great, but is there any hard evidence of a God who has spoken here? Now there's a big question. Travelling around the Middle East on a father and son adventure, 12-year-old Marcus and I will see for ourselves. We'll take a critical look at a prediction 25 centuries old to see what it prophesied about Jerusalem and its Messiah King, and to ask whether that came true in history. We'll also visit Iraq and Iran. We really want to know, if this prediction is accurate, could it be evidence of a God who knows and speaks?
Many Christians, they never heard about these things. And many Jews, of course, never heard about these things.
I don't know how a rational person can look at some of these things and not say, wow, that's powerful.
This is the text which started my journey into discovering the face of the Messiah.
Some say we're accidents in a universe born by chance. Some say we're children of God. I'm Grenville Kent, a Christian academic, and the new atheists have got me questioning my faith. So I'm going wherever the questions take me with my ever-curious son, Marcus, and talking to leading thinkers on both sides of the God question. Because I really want the evidence. Is there a God? And will I ever find a hat that fits?
Bullshit.
Is there a God who knows the future? In this harsh land, scrolls were found predicting in detail events that happened centuries later in Jerusalem. Could they reveal a God behind the scenes of history, predicting the future to whoever will listen? Our story begins in war. This cinema-sized Assyrian artwork shows siege warfare on an ancient city. See the battering rams, the siege ladders, tunneling under the wall.
Well, the basic premise is to starve those inhabitants out of the city by not allowing any foodstuffs to come in. These were gruesome elements of warfare. They would place stakes and they would impale individuals and surround cities with these impaled individuals on these stakes. These could have been their neighbors. And the message was very clear: either give up to us or this will happen to you.
Kings strengthened defensive walls and built tunnels to protect the vital water supply. But still the city fell. Foreign empires led away many of Israel's people as slaves. Babylon's army wrecked Jerusalem and its temple and took the greatest resource of any country, bright, young people. One was a genius called Daniel, who would write the history of Jerusalem in advance, foretelling events centuries ahead. It's his prophecy that we will examine. He served at the king's palace in Babylon. Babylon is now called Iraq, and we went there. I can tell you the suites are amazing. The headgear fits even my big head, and the man in the street knows his country's proud history. But I can't show you the city of Babylon where Daniel wrote, because we were stopped by military action. This is how it looked before Saddam Hussein's war. As an exile in Babylon, Daniel prays that Jerusalem will be rebuilt. and God will send his chosen king, the Messiah, or Mashiach. Back in Jerusalem, we asked a rabbi what this meant to the Jewish people.
The Jewish people located in this little part of the world were getting in the way because we're right on the axis between the three continents and therefore the whole of the old world. And people were conquering us and casting us out to different places of the world, and we were in exile. We were looking, therefore, in exile to returning back to our land, where one who is therefore anointed to be king, Mashiach, Messiah, would rule over the people. But he is a human being who fulfills a certain role at a time when God brings about the ingathering of the exiles and an era of universal peace, as envisaged by the prophets.
So Daniel, a slave in Iraq around 550 BC, was hoping God would send a king, Messiah, to set Jerusalem free. And he claims God supernaturally revealed the future to him, and he wrote it down. That can sound like religious fantasy. So let's see if there's any evidence for it. To hear Daniel's exact prediction, we went to a synagogue. But first, I had to work out how to keep my prayer cap on. Good?
Hi, welcome to our synagogue. I'm Connie.
Nice to meet you.
Come in, come in.
ממוצאם דבר ולהשיב ולבנות ירושלים עד משיח נגיד שבועים 7 ושבועים 62 יכרת משיח ואין לו והעיר והקודש ישחית.
In case you didn't catch that the first time, 77s are decreed for your people and your holy city. From the issuing of the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem, until Messiah, the ruler, comes, there will be 7 sevens and 62 sevens. The Messiah will be cut off, but not for himself. The city and sanctuary will be destroyed by the people of the ruler who will come.
Daniel's prediction had 4 key details. Jerusalem would be rebuilt. Then after an exact period of time, Messiah would appear. But Messiah would be killed, and Jerusalem and its temple would be destroyed by yet another invader. That was almost unthinkable.
Daniel even gives the exact time from the rebuilding of Jerusalem to the arrival of its Messiah king. It's 69 sevens.
But what are the sevens?
We enjoyed a Sabbath meal with a Jewish family. Their week is built around the 7th day. And the law of Moses gave the Jewish people every 7th year off work, a sabbatical. So they've traditionally thought in 7-year periods, just like some of us think in decades.
So Daniel's sevens means 7-year periods, and 69 sevens would make 483 years.
So Daniel predicts Messiah would arrive 483 years after the order to rebuild Jerusalem. That order came from Persian kings who ruled the region. So we went to Persia, now called Iran, to check whether Daniel got his bold prediction wrong or right. We couldn't believe the welcome from everyone we met.
Everyone was so friendly.
Persia became a superpower under King Cyrus II, who ruled from this palace. Babylon's empire had taken whole nations as slaves, but Cyrus freed them and sent them home. Some see him as fatherly and caring about human rights. Others see a shrewd dictator buying loyalty.
But either way, Cyrus freed the Jews.
He allowed the indigenous people to reestablish their identity. He rebuilt their temples. He rebuilt their cities. He returned their gods that had been taken by the Babylonians. And it's in this context then that we have the Jewish people being allowed to return to Israel.
This history is confirmed by the Cyrus Cylinder, a document from the Persian side and a treasure of archaeology.
The Cyrus Cylinder says actually very distinctly, I have gathered their former inhabitants and have returned them to their habitations, which is an indication that he just did exactly what the Bible had predicted he would do.
Cyrus freed the Jews, but he died before they were able to rebuild their city. Rebuilding would require permission from other Persian kings.
It would take nearly a century and the reign of 5 kings, Cyrus, Cambyses, Darius the Great, Xerxes I, before finally Artaxerxes I would order the rebuilding of Jerusalem. And he issued that decree in 457 BC.
When I was first given that prophecy and I was shown 457 BC, I said, I'm going to study this out, the 7th year of the reign of Artaxerxes. So I go to the library. I'm brand new. I don't know who Artaxerxes is. I don't know Babylon. I don't know any of this stuff. Go through the stacks, and I'm looking through all these books, and I pull out a book, and sure enough, 7th year of the reign of Artaxerxes, 457 BC.
Daniel died before his beloved Jerusalem was rebuilt. His tomb here in Iran is sacred to Muslims, and Jews and Christians also recognize him as a prophet. But from 457 BC, the rebuilding of Jerusalem began. The order to rebuild Jerusalem was the starting point for Daniel's timed prediction of the coming Messiah. Daniel had predicted it would take 69 sevens, or 483 years. That time period ended in AD 27. Around AD 27, scholars suggest, Jesus of Nazareth was baptized in the Jordan River and began his public life.
27 AD was the baptism of Jesus. Jesus began his ministry, his work of being the Messiah and the healing and revealing the character of God to the world, and then ultimately offering himself as a sacrifice for the sins of the world.
He gave his first speech at this site, and he taught in this synagogue. His first recorded public words suggest the time prophecy of Daniel. The time is fulfilled, and the kingdom of God is near. Repent and believe the good news.
Jesus taught publicly in Jerusalem, and he divided the city. Some said he was the long-awaited Messiah. They reported miracles like the healing of a lame man in this pool complex. Others said he was a fraud, demonic, a false Messiah. 2,000 years later, he's still controversial.
This Messiah, the one who has been anointed by God, is supposed to be killed. And this is, of course, a big paradox.
How would Messiah the King die? Who would do that? Enter the Romans. Their governor or procurator ruled from a palace by the beach. The great Roman historian Tacitus wrote that Jesus was put to death by Pontius Pilate, procurator of Judea in the reign of Tiberius.
This tower protected a palace which the Roman procurators used as their Jerusalem residence. And so it was down here in the Praetorium that Pontius Pilate sentenced Jesus of Nazareth to be flogged and crucified.
Pontius Pilatus.
That's the right heel bone of a man named Yehochanan, crucifixion being the most humiliating and torturous death the Romans could give to a thief, a murderer, or a rebel.
For Messiah the King to receive treatment like that seemed unthinkable. It was Roman nails and weapons that killed Jesus. And the archaeology shows traces of key characters of the gospel story.
This elegant ossuary, or bone box, is a mention of Caiaphas, the high priest who condemned Jesus and sent him to Pilate.
The actual place of Jesus' death is debated. This church is built on one possible site. Other historians argue for a different location.
This may seem like a pretty ordinary place for the biggest event in Christianity, the crucifixion of Jesus. But some have called that Skull Hill back there, and they've argued that it's just 50 meters outside the city walls. It's right near a garden, which fits with the Gospel of John, and perhaps most important, it's on a very busy road. And we know that the Romans like to hold their crucifixions with maximum public impact. You can see these games etched into the pavement where Roman soldiers would dice for the lives of their prisoners. And a similar thing is reported while Jesus is dying. The soldiers are said to be gambling for his clothes.
Daniel had said Messiah would be cut off or killed, but not for himself. Daniel also said Messiah would be killed in the middle of a 7. That would be 3.5 years. And Jesus' public ministry lasted 3.5 years. So Jesus' ministry began and ended exactly as Daniel predicted. The precision is striking.
You put those numbers together, I don't think it's just coincidence that it happens to bring you to the time that we believe that Jesus lived and did his ministry and died.
Daniel's third prediction had come true. And the Romans would also fulfill the fourth one with siege warfare on Jerusalem.
It would have taken a lot of work to destroy this city.
This is one of the massive limestone blocks that Herod put in his western wall. That was a retaining wall to support the earthworks on which the temple was built, the new improved temple, way up there it stood. This one block weighs 570 metric tons, which is more than a 747 fully laden. It's 3.5 meters tall, higher than a basketball hoop, 4 meters that way, and a whopping 13.5 meters long, ends here. You really have to wonder how they moved it. One archaeologist told me, very slowly, taking care of their fingers.
Jerusalem's temple was one of the wonders of the ancient world.
The Romans told them, just obey us. There were continual revolts. They just ultimately couldn't fight them. Rome was Rome.
These stones were hurled down from the Temple Mount, even higher than the wall we see now, and crashed into the main street here. The Roman soldiers, after all the brutal fighting, were taking horrible vengeance on Jerusalem, tearing it apart stone by stone. Many Jews had died in the siege and in the fighting, but now the Romans slaughtered more and took many others as slaves to dig in salt mines, to row ships across the Roman Empire, their children wandering anywhere but home for centuries. It really was one of the great tragedies of history.
Yeah, it has been remembered in Jewish history as the most dramatic event, because the destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple was lived throughout all the centuries as if it was the destruction of the world. Because the sanctuary, the temple, represented the cosmos.
Again, Jerusalem was ruled by other nations. About 500 years later, the Jewish temple site became a mosque. To Muslims, Jerusalem is the third holiest site on earth. Today, Jews worship at the Western Wall, the remnant of their original temple. In Rome, the Victory Arch of Titus shows the candlestick taken from Jerusalem's temple. Daniel's predictions from centuries before had been fulfilled precisely. Can humans know the future like that?
I mean, if you have a naturalistic, materialistic worldview, how do you explain something like this?
You might be asking yourself how this could be faked. You could write your prophecy in vague, mystical terms that mean anything. But this is not that. It's not even symbolism. It's clear language describing a city, historical events, and a time period. But what if someone faked it by writing the book after the events had already happened and pretending it had been written before? To find out when the book of Daniel was written, we traveled to the Dead Sea.
It's so salty you can't sing.
And the air is so dry that ancient manuscripts don't rot. Here in the Qumran caves in 1947, a young Arab shepherd named Mohammed discovered something priceless: the scrolls of a Jewish community of copyists, including nearly all the books of the Hebrew Bible. They had been hidden in jars, and they were about 2,000 years old. They're studied and preserved here.
This 4Q114 is the earliest dated scroll of Daniel. This goes back to the second half of the 2nd century. In other words, this scroll was composed about 50 years after the finalization of the book of Daniel itself. That's why this is so important to us.
How many separate manuscripts of Daniel are there?
We have 8 scrolls that contain the book of Daniel.
We looked at the high-tech art of manuscript analysis.
So see, this is the topography of it. This is the infrared.
This is the name of Daniel.
Right. How do we know the dates of these scrolls? That is done primarily by the paleography, by the way in which the scrolls are written, the script.
Bottom line, the manuscripts of Daniel have not changed appreciably in over 2,000 years.
If the book of Daniel was written around 150 BC, it's predicting events up to 200 years into the future with such accuracy, you'd have to wonder if it's humanly possible. And there's evidence the book was written even before that.
The book of Daniel was accepted as part of the Bible by 150 BC, and that acceptance wouldn't have happened quickly, so it must have been written well before.
If they were already accepted by the community as part of the scriptures at that time, part of the Bible, how is it that they could have been written in 150 BC, and yet all these 8 copies are appearing there at 150 BC? The composition of Daniel had to be earlier in order for it to already be accepted at this time. That indicates to me an earlier date than the 2nd century.
The young conqueror Alexander the Great heard a reading from Daniel's book in Jerusalem in 330 BC, according to Flavius Josephus, the leading historian on the period. Alexander was about to attack Jerusalem, but Jewish priests showed him Daniel's book, where one of the other prophecies said Alexander's Greek army would defeat the Persians.
Alexander was flattered to be mentioned in somebody else's holy book, though they didn't read in the part about his death. And so he didn't destroy Jerusalem. He actually made every 7th year tax-free so the Jews could keep their Sabbath years. This event helps us date the book of Daniel to before 330 BC.
According to the book of Daniel itself, it has been written in the time of Daniel, which is the 6th century BC. And also there are other evidences, and many evidences. One of them, the Aramaic language, which has been identified as Eastern Aramaic and not Western Aramaic, which shows that the book of Daniel really must have been written in the 6th century BC.
So it seems Daniel's prediction was written early. But you may see another problem. Most Jews say Jesus is not the Messiah.
So when the Jesus followers came along and they said to their Jewish brothers and sisters, this guy is the Messiah, they said, well, look, there are lots of people making these claims. If he is the one, then obviously the messianic expectations are going to be fulfilled in him. When Jesus died and there was no end to the exile and to Roman persecution, there was no ingathering and there was no universal peace, then the Jewish attitude towards the Jesus followers was, well, you must have been wrong.
Almost no one expected Messiah to die. But we reminded ourselves of what Daniel's prediction had said. Messiah would be cut off, but not for himself. That's very clear. Messiah dies. Most people expected Messiah to rule the world. So when Jesus died, they wrote him off. But being cut off was exactly what Daniel had predicted for Messiah to do. So rather than proving him a failed Messiah, Jesus' death could show the exact opposite. To follow the story of Daniel's prophecy, we've travelled the Middle East. We've seen how ancient his writings are.
See, this is the topography of it.
With expert help, we've critically examined Daniel's prediction that his home city would be rebuilt, that Messiah would come there 483 years later, but that Messiah would be killed 3.5 years after that, and that Jerusalem would again be destroyed. The accuracy is striking. How do you foresee these things centuries before? Daniel himself didn't claim his human genius could predict the future. He said God had spoken. So could this be evidence pointing to a God who knows and speaks to the human race?
Could this be a genuine example of predicting the future in detail? Isn't that kind of knowledge beyond human ability? So could it be one evidence that there is a God who knows our future? Doesn't this prediction highlight the life and death of Jesus of Nazareth as important for the world? And when Jesus taught here and quoted Daniel to give people hope of God's coming kingdom of peace, was that too good to be true or just too good to be human? Daniel's prediction gives me a solid reason to hope. What do you think?